In my Analysis for Composers course, I touched on the importance of dynamics in musical form. Here I want to discuss dynamics from the point of view of orchestration. Orchestration and dynamics are closely linked, but in rather complex ways. First, let's imagine a scale of dynamics from triple piano to triple forte. In this scale, triple piano means so quiet that the listener is not entirely sure there's anything happening at all, and triple forte means maximum loudness. Now we apply this scale to each orchestral family. That means that, as a group, the family can or cannot achieve that dynamic. A special note about the woodwinds. Although the low clarinet can be very quiet indeed, the woodwinds as a group are never on the verge of being inaudible. Under each dynamic, I've listed the orchestral families that can achieve that level. Note that not all instruments in a given family necessarily have the same dynamics, and also that, especially in winds and brass, dynamics depend a lot on register. So, for example, a flute playing middle C, double forte, will not sound nearly as loud as the C 2 octaves higher. The point of this chart is that when it comes to extreme dynamics, certain families are simply incapable of achieving them. For example, strings can enter so softly that you're not even sure if they're playing or not. Brass can never attack quite this quietly and discreetly. Similarly, woodwinds can't equal the loudest brass sounds, except perhaps the piccolo, which in any case is pretty much alone up there in its highest range. There's no competition up there. Interestingly, the one family that can go from inaudible to dominating the whole orchestra is the percussion. Not all percussion instruments have this capacity, but several of them, like timpani or suspended cymbal, can come in virtually unnoticed, but can also drown out everyone else when they're at their loudest. The chart above refers to what might call absolute dynamics. However, most of us have occasionally seen brass parts marked triple piano and woodwind parts marked triple forte. These should be thought of as relative dynamics. Brass marked triple piano or even quadruple piano are simply going to try and play as quietly as they can, given the register and the kind of music. But they'll never achieve the kind of almost silence of, say, a cymbal roll in the same dynamics. There are also relative dynamics within individual instruments. For example, for an oboe playing a low B flat, there's still a certain dynamic range available, but extremely soft dynamics are not possible in this register. Within the oboe's range, it's easier to play more quietly in the higher register than in the low register. Each woodwind instrument has its own dynamic characteristics. Students should have learned them in introductory orchestration. The composer needs to think of both absolute and relative dynamics. When a composer imagines a musical idea, dynamics have a huge influence on the musical character. If you want to create a mysterious character, you'll probably want something very quiet. If you want something triumphant, you'll probably aim for something assertive and loud. The desired dynamics for your musical ideas should govern your orchestration decisions. If you want an extremely quiet passage, don't give it the high trumpets and trombones. In other words, orchestrate your dynamics. Don't just write the dynamics in the score. This principle goes even farther. Many orchestral textures have foreground and one or more background layers. The choice of the background must always be determined by what's in the foreground. If you have an important melody in the trumpet, there are many possibilities for the accompaniment. But if your melody is for a low solo flute, there are very few possible accompaniments that will really remain in the background, as they should. Listen to this melody for low flute accompanied by horns. Even though the horns aren't playing loudly, they make the flute sound like the background. Now the same melody accompanied by violas divisi. What a difference. This principle also affects the dynamics you choose to write in the score. Unless you're a very experienced orchestrator or arranger, don't mark different dynamics to control orchestral balance. Rather, choose the instruments and registers that will automatically result in the effect you want. It's no use accompanying a loud assertive melody with low flutes marked triple forte. Better simply use another instrument that isn't as pale and weak as the flute in its lowest register. Rimsky-Korsakov talks about orchestration that sounds well at first reading versus orchestration that requires more rehearsal. Orchestrating your dynamics helps to put your orchestration in the first category, which also saves expensive rehearsal time. Another area where your dynamics should influence your orchestral choices is during dynamic changes, like crescendo and diminuendo. Don't orchestrate a crescendo while removing instruments, and don't ask for a diminuendo while adding instruments. Otherwise, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. A crescendo while instruments are being removed will detract from the expressive force of the music. Note that an accent is really a change in dynamics. Applying our principle of orchestrating our dynamics, we can see that to make an accent more effective, you can simply add something. If you're starting an energetic musical section, you could trigger it with a sharp chord in brass or percussion. Other common forms of orchestral accent include harp, or string double stops, provided they're easy to play, and pizzicato strings. Obviously, the way you accent the passage will depend on its character. Adding a harp chord to a loud tutti climax won't make much difference. Similarly, you don't want a cymbal crash at the peak of a gentle phrase in the oboe. Here's an example, a trumpet melody accompanied by pizzicato strings. This isn't bad, but it could be better. Here it is with a harp trigger. I've also added the harp in the last bar to reinforce the accents there. The musical character has become much more vivid. Similarly, at the peak of a crescendo, there's normally a point of maximum tension. This is always more effective if we save something in the orchestration and add it at that point. Normally, louder music requires more instruments in the orchestra. For maximum force, normally most or all of the orchestra will be playing. A tutti marked triple piano will never sound really quiet. Of course, this doesn't mean that a quiet passage can't have all the families of the orchestra present. It would also depend on what they're doing. But for extreme dynamics, don't ask for the impossible. Beethoven shows us something profound in this regard in his Ninth Symphony, where he has a very quiet passage using all the families in the orchestra, starting in measure 513. Let's listen. Beethoven understood that having all the instruments present like this in a quiet dynamic can create a kind of threatening effect, provided the other dimensions of the music also point in that direction. Here, the repeated bass ostinato in D minor gives a sense that the orchestra is like an army, advancing quietly. In other words, Beethoven saw the expressive potential of this situation. It's not just a result of carelessness or ineptitude. But just marking a tutti passage as pianissimo won't give it this character just by itself. There's one last aspect to how we perceive orchestral dynamics that the French composer Charles Lecouchlin explains in his monumental 4-volume orchestration treatise. He speaks there of the difference between loudness and volume. By volume, he means the fatness of the sound. Imagine a solo horn and a solo violin, each playing middle C. No matter what the dynamic, the horn is always going to sound fatter than the violin. An important consequence of this, because of the contrast effects we've already discussed, is the issue of successive balance. If you follow a loud tutti, for example with a high oboe solo, the oboe is going to sound particularly thin. In other words, we always perceive the effect of a passage in a certain context. So it's essential for the composer to think through orchestral decisions both locally and in context to avoid such distracting surprises. To sum up, orchestrate your dynamics. When the texture has more than one plane of tone, the choice of the background is always limited by what's in the foreground.